And now we are moving to our third speaker, Professor Marta Havryshk. I think that I mispronounced your name. Did I? She's an
No,
historian. Can you correct me, please, Marta?
Marta Havryshko. It's very
Havryshk.
Ukrainian. Yeah, Havryshko.
Havryshko.
It works.
Havryshko, who is
Yes.
an historian, and she's a visiting assistant professor in Holocaust pedagogy and anti-Semitism studies at the Castle Center of Holocaust and Genocide in Clark University, and she spoke about it at the beginning. She has published many studies about sexual violence against women during World War II and the Holocaust, and also the Ukrainian nationalist movement and sexual violence during that war and genocide. So, Marta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lily. Can I kindly ask you, do you see my presentation?
Yes, we see it.
It's
Yeah, thank
okay.
you so much, Lily. So great. I'm very honored to be here and very pleased to be here as a presenter because I must admit, as a Ukraine scholar, I learned from the book of Sonia and Rochelle so much and from other scholars in the West because in Ukraine, I was a pioneer actually in studying sexual violence during the Holocaust. And I actually suffered a lot because of that in Ukraine. I suffered anti-Semitism and I was, I was blamed for anti-patriotic study in Ukraine. Um, and I was forced basically to leave Ukraine, firstly because of the war, and secondly because of this peer pressure. Um, it was very difficult for me to develop my book that I'm developing here in US on sexual violence during the Holocaust in Ukraine, because my main focus in this book are local perpetrators of sexual violence against Jewish women, primarily and girls, and nowadays I include Jewish men and boys. So local perpetrators are not only members of local auxiliary police, local administration under Nazis, but also ordinary men who abuse their power. Those also who were aid givers, who positioned themselves as rescuers, and they abused their powers and demanded sexual favors from those vulnerable Jewish women and girls. So nowadays, here in US, I'm trying to develop this book interrupted by war and my rescue operation because I was trying to rescue my son and then my husband. And here now we are in Clark, and where I'm teaching Holocaust as well. I am teaching anti-Semitism and racism, and also I have entire course about sexual violence in war and genocide and sexual violence during the Holocaust. It's a big part of this course, and I include not only violence against Jewish women and girls, but also violence against queer people, including gay men and other queer people and lesbian women. So at the beginning of our event, Lily wonderfully actually presented those functions of sexual violence and why primarily Jewish women are targeted during the Holocaust. Yes, so sexual violence in every ethnic conflicts, yeah, and every war and genocide is a tool of terror and intimidation, punishment and retaliation, reward, bonding between fighters, compensation for fighters, especially if fighters are recruiters from different localities. It's a method of torture, and it has economic functions, and also it's a tool of ethnic cleansing and genocide, and especially during the Holocaust, when we are talking about forced abortion, when we are talking about medical examination, medical experiments, for example, yeah, forced abortion, and so on and so forth. It's a clear sign of reproductive violence. It's a clear sign of genocidal sexual violence. And why women, Lily talked about this, women body play a very symbolic role in national narrative. It's not only, some specific, body, female body. It's a body of entire nation. It's a body that represents nation, that reproduce nation biologically. It's a keeper of national honor and the honor of its defenders. And also, when we are talking about these patriarchal gender norms, women's bodies are perceived as a property of enemy men. That's why it's a battlefield, as Professor Zamir pointed out. That's why it's an instrument of male-male communication. When you violate women's body, you send a message to the enemy man that he is not fully man because he can't protect a woman's body. So we have this very gendered power dynamic. Here I put the most common forms of sexual violence during the Holocaust. And of course, those forms are not limited only to rape and attempted rape, but also forced nudity, sexual slavery, sexualized torture, forced penetration with objects, forced sterilization, abortions, prostitution, castration, and genital mutilation. But today, I want to concentrate on women's agency. When I started to dig this topic, I was full of frustration and anger. As a woman, I constantly thought about this pain of women that they suffer. I thought about their children who were, in many cases, witnesses of this violence. I cried a lot, but then I, started to think about agency of those women, very limited agency and very limited choices. But today, when I witness so many conflicts, and when after 7 October we witnessed and hear stories of women in captivity, women on this music festival, Nova Festival, who were violated, and we listen to their stories. Once again, we are trying to understand how women can survive, and can survive this violence, and find capability to live further, and be inspiration to other women with a similar experience. So when I listen to the stories of survivors of sexual violence during the Holocaust, I listen many stories when women we are trying to be involved in active resistance. For example, like Sonia Diamond from Volyn region, she explained when she was trying to resist to one Pole who pretend to be her rescuer, but at the same time was trying to violate her. But we should be very careful when we listen to these stories, because we can be in this trap that there are good women who resist, and there are other women who fail to resist somehow, yes? And then we have stories like the story of Raisa, 13-year-old Ukraine girl from Nova Pavlivka, Odessa Oblast, who was violated by her fellow villager. He was 18 years old and he became a policeman under German occupation. And he raped her when he was her guardian during Nazi period. And he raped him. And after the war, he became a main witness in his case. And she attempted several times to tell the judges, to tell the state prosecutor that she actually was violated by him. But nobody trusted her. They constantly asked her questions. Why why nobody heard her screaming? Why nobody saw any signs on her body of active resistance? And what I witnessed in this court material from 1954, this is phenomenon that we can call nowadays a rape culture. And we still are dealing with this rape culture in justice system in our everyday life when survivors of sexual violence should prove that they resisted actively, that this wasn't a sex, this was actually a rape, this was a violence. And many survivors, Holocaust survivors, dealt with this rape culture after the war. That's why we should be very careful when we are talking, when we are listening to survivors and dealing with their testimonies. And we should remember that those who survive sexual violence could choose the strategy to not to resist in order to survive, actually. And this strategy is a resistance by itself because survival is a resistance to the Holocaust. When we listen to testimonies of Holocaust survivors, we see many stories that belong to so-called gray zone with many women in attempt to survive and to rescue their loved ones, their parents, other members of Jewish group, of their friends, use their body as a survival tool. So Galina Klotzman from Antonovka camp in Kyiv Oblast described her friend from the camp, and she said she chose this strategy. So she used her body as a bribe, as a sexual bribe. So we are dealing with nowadays Anna Haikova and other scholars call sexual barter. So it was, as we see from this quote, probably the phenomenon that we can call sexual barter, when in circumstances of very limited choices and very limited agencies, women were trying to resist Holocaust and to survive by any means. But it doesn't mean that women enjoy this choice. It doesn't mean that women didn't suffer. And the case of Communist Podil's ghetto and testimony of survivor Clara is a very clear evidence of that. During her you see her testimony to Soviet authorities. She mentioned the list of Jewish women and girls who were forced basically to trade themselves in order to get out from this ghetto and find some food because they were hungry, their family members were hungry, and they made this, deal with the devil, meaning local Ukraine policeman who was a guardian and who abused his power and took advantage of the situation. And those desperate women cried and tell about what they did in forced to make those choices in order to survive. Rina made her choice to trade her body to local capo in order to save her mom. because she was left only with her mom in Lviv during the Second World War. And this couple knew her very well. They both pretend to be Christians. It was their survival strategy during the war. And he found out and he promised her to to basically to renounce her, to call her out, and she decided to deal with this in this manner. And she it's very interesting to hear to her story and how she's making sense of what she did, and she even blamed herself for this choice because of all these stereotypes and because of this social pressure and sexual norms and this sexual morality that we Jewish women faced during the war and after the war that we actually heard at the beginning of our lecture. Another story told by Henry, and this story actually says a lot about inversion of gender roles during the war. Gender roles before the war were, in many cases, very patriarchal, especially in pre-war Ukraine Jewish society. Yeah, even when we are talking about city like Lviv and towns like Ternopil and Bucha and other small shtetls, Ukraine shtetls, where men were breadwinners, head of families, and women were primarily housekeepers and mothers. Here we see war changed gender roles. Women were breadwinners, women were rescuers, women were those who had bigger chances for survival and founding some means for survival, and their body and their sexuality became this very powerful instrument. And here we see how Henry reached the farm of one locals and asked him to hide him, but at the same time his sister Sarah was already hiding there. So this farmer proposed a deal, basically, and nobody and Sarah made a choice, so she sacrificed her in order to save her brother. So we see this inversion of those gender roles, and we see she will do it, yes, and will save both of us. Yes, and it's very dramatic choice for her, but it's very conscious choice, and she was very well aware. They were both aware about the consequences of this choice. So we are talking about many, many, many shadows of those choices during the Holocaust. And the final point of this of my presentation. I want to say that um, um, in our introduction, we heard a lot about shaming of many Holocaust survivors, female survivors after the war. They were asked how they survived. Yeah, their sexual behavior was questioned. Yeah, they were blamed sometimes for so-called sexual collaboration with the enemy, or with the Germans, or with the local collaborators. But in many cases, they were forced to do that by elderly members of Jewish communities. Like here, in this case, in case of Zita, Yeah, she became basically a victim of these circumstances. Yeah, when elderly Jews came to her and asked her to be a lover of local gendarmerie in Kopai Gorod ghetto in order to save other members, other fellow Jews. And my second point today, agency of Jewish women was expressed not only during the Holocaust in terms of sexual violence, resistance to sexual violence. And finding different survival strategy, but also during after the Holocaust, when women were trying to fight for justice for them and other victims of sexual violence who were silenced by death or were not ready to fight for justice. After the war, Soviet Union was instrumentalizing this gendered suffering of Jewish women. They organized show trials where they didn't care about their identity and about personality of female survivors. They published their names. They published every single details about their rape. Why? Because they wanted to put in trial local perpetrators, especially if they were members of Ukraine nationalist underground movement. And for example, you hear.
Marta, you have to conclude.
Yes, yes. And my final thought, Clara's story is one of the most powerful story in this regard, one of the most inspiring story of Jewish female agency after the Second World War. Because Clara, here you see her on this grave mass, the site of a mass shooting where her relatives were killed, and where she and other 15 Jewish girls were picked up and were raped during this night. And she was the one who survived, and she managed to put on trial her perpetrator, Andrusiv, who was back then a leader ahead of local police. And this show trial was organized. He was a facilitator of this mass rape, and she became a voice of those 16 Jewish girls and women who were perpetrated and sexually violated by Germans. Her voice was very powerful, and thanks to her, locals and other people learn about victimization, sexual victimization of Jewish women during the Holocaust. Thank you so much for your attention.